It is 10 o'clock on the night of March 22nd, 1945. The Rhine River rolls through the dark at 3 knots, cold and black, carrying the last winter of the war toward the sea. On the western bank, in the shadow of bare vineyards and shuttered farmhouses, something is moving. Not tanks, not artillery, men on foot, carrying boats by hand through mud fields in absolute silence. No engines, no radio chatter, no cigarettes. Just boots in wet earth and the sound of breath controlled by discipline and fear in equal measure. 300 miles to the north, the world is watching a different river crossing. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery is preparing the most elaborate military operation since D-Day. 1 million men, 4,000 artillery pieces, 36 Royal Navy landing craft transported overland from the English Channel. The entire weight of Allied planning focused on 1.1 night, one crossing that everyone from Berlin to London knows is coming. Nobody is watching Oppenheim. Nobody has been assigned to watch it because nobody in the German High Command believes anything is going to happen here. According to every calculation, every intelligence assessment, every logical projection made by some of the most experienced military planners in Europe, this stretch of river is not a target. It barely appears on their priority defense lists. It is a small wine town on the western bank with low flat banks and a manageable current, and the Rhine here runs no more than 1,000 feet wide, and none of that matters because no commander in his right mind would attempt a major river crossing here without weeks of preparation, without artillery softening the far bank, without air cover rolling in first. They are about to be catastrophically wrong. And the reason they are wrong has a name, a high, reedy voice that surprised everyone who met him, 2 ivory-handled revolvers, and 60 years of absolute certainty that the rules of war were written for other men. His name is George Smith Patton, Jr., and he has been waiting his entire life for this river. To understand what is about to happen on the night of March 22nd, you need to understand what the Rhine actually is. Not the geography, not the width, or the current, or the strategic value, what it means, what it has always meant. The Rhine is not simply a river. It rises in the Swiss Alps and drains into the North Sea after 820 miles of defining the edge of everything. For more than 2,000 years, it served as the physical boundary of the Roman world. Julius Caesar crossed it in 55 BCE, not because military necessity demanded it, but because crossing it was a statement. A demonstration that Rome could reach beyond the known world and return again. He built a bridge of timber in 10 days, marched his legions across, spent 18 days making his point to the Germanic tribes on the far bank, and then withdrew. He crossed it again in 53 BCE for the same reason. The crossing itself was the message. After the Romans pulled back, the Rhine became something more powerful in the German imagination than any military barrier could be. It became identity. It became belonging. In 1840, a poet named Max Schneckenburger wrote a patriotic anthem called Die Wacht am Rhein, the Watch on the Rhine. It became the marching song of German armies for generations. Children learned it in school. Old men hummed it without knowing they were humming it. The river was not water. It was myth. It was the thing you defended when everything else had already been lost. By March of 1945, everything else had already been lost. The German High Command had spent months fortifying the eastern bank. They had positioned artillery in the hills above the water. They had blown up almost every bridge across the Rhine, the railway bridges, the road bridges. The ancient spans that had stood for centuries sent them into the current rather than leave them standing for Allied armor to use. They had drawn up scenarios for every conceivable Allied crossing attempt, gaming out responses to attacks at Wesel, at Cologne, at Düsseldorf, at Ries. Berlin knew the Allies were coming across the Rhine. The only question was where. They did not seriously plan for Oppenheim. It appeared on their maps the way a footnote appears in a document. Present, technically, but not the thing anyone was reading. The garrison assigned to this sector consisted largely of Volkssturm, the militia of last resort that the Reich had been assembling since the desperate autumn of 1944. Factory workers in their 50s, Elderly men who had survived one war already and been handed bolt-action rifles and told to hold the sacred river of the German nation. No meaningful artillery, no reserves capable of rapid response, no infrastructure for calling help quickly enough to matter. This is what was waiting on the far bank. This is what George Patton had found. The man who found it was 60 years old in March of 1945, and he looked like Central Casting's idea of a general and sounded nothing like it. The voice was the first thing people noticed when they finally met him in person. They expected something deep and commanding to match the gleaming helmet and the ivory revolvers and the swagger that preceded him into every room. What they got was high and reedy, and almost startling a voice that belonged to a school teacher rather than a conqueror. He wore those revolvers everywhere. The helmet was lacquered to a shine that caught light in ways that standard-issue equipment was never designed to catch light. He prayed every morning with what people who knew him described as genuine devotion, then spent the afternoons generating profanity that military historians would later describe as genuinely creative. He believed without irony and without embarrassment that he had lived past lives. A Roman legionary, a Napoleonic cavalryman. He had studied the battles of antiquity not as history, but as professional development, reading accounts of Caesar's Rhine crossings, the way a surgeon reads anatomy. He had been wounded in the First World War and come back. He had been suspended from command in 1943 after striking a hospitalized soldier in Sicily, a moment of rage that cost him months and nearly cost him everything, and he had fought his way back from that too. He had led the breakout from Normandy in the summer of 1944, driving his Third Army across France at a pace that stunned Allied planners who had spent months building cautious timetables. He had wheeled that same army 90 degrees north during the Battle of the Bulge to relieve the 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne, a redeployment executed in darkness and winter weather that military historians still study as a masterpiece of rapid movement. The pivot required moving roughly 100,000 men and all their equipment in less than 72 hours. His staff told him it would take longer. He told them it would not. He had been reading about the Rhine for years before the war brought him to its banks. He knew that Julius Caesar had crossed it twice. He knew that Napoleon had crossed it. He knew that no invading army had successfully made an opposed assault crossing of the Rhine since Napoleon's era, making whatever was about to happen here the first such crossing in approximately 140 years. He had been tracking that fact in his mind the way a man tracks a debt he intends to collect. He wanted his name next to those names. 300 miles to the north, the man whose name was already being written into the history books of this crossing was Bernard Law Montgomery. And the contrast between the two of them illuminates everything that is about to happen on the dark banks at Oppenheim. Montgomery was small, precise, and absolutely convinced of his own genius in a way that managed to be simultaneously correct and insufferable. He did not drink. He did not smoke. He was deeply religious in a different way than Patton, more structured, more outward, the faith of a man who organized everything, including his relationship with God. He had taken the shattered remnants of the British Eighth Army after the disasters of the North African campaign and rebuilt them into a force that won at El Alamein in 1942. He had commanded the ground forces on D-Day. He was, by any honest measure, one of the most accomplished soldiers of the entire conflict. He was also, by nearly universal agreement among the American generals who worked alongside him, extraordinarily difficult. His planning style was methodical to a degree that sometimes crossed a line that military professionals argue about even now. He would not move until everything was prepared. He would not attack until he had air superiority, artillery dominance, secure supply lines, rehearsed troops, and numerical advantage. The logic was unimpeachable. The results, when the conditions were met, were often excellent. The cost was time, and in the winter and spring of 1945, time was a currency that had a meaning beyond the military. Every week the war continued was more men in the ground on both sides. Eisenhower himself, according to aides whose accounts appear in multiple post-war memoirs, said privately that Montgomery was the only man in either army he genuinely could not get along with. This was a man who had spent 3 years managing egos that included George Patton so that assessment carries weight. For 6 weeks in February and March of 1945, Montgomery had been preparing Operation Plunder. The scale was something that tested the edges of logistics planning. More than 1 million men from 3 nationalities, roughly 4,000 artillery pieces, 36 Royal Navy landing craft transported overland from the English Channel on specialized trailers. A massive smoke screen that had been running continuously since March 16th to hide the preparations from German reconnaissance aircraft. And on the morning of March 24th, the day after the planned assault, crossing 14,000 paratroopers were scheduled to drop east of the Rhine in Operation Varsity, which would become the largest single-day airborne operation ever executed. Montgomery intended to cross at Wesel on the night of March the 23rd. The whole world knew it was coming. The Germans knew it was coming. There was no particular secret about it because there could not be given the sheer scale of moving 1 million men and 4,000 guns into position. You cannot hide that. The broad strokes were as visible from Berlin as they were from London. The logic of plunder was not surprise. It was overwhelming force. When you bring enough of everything, surprise becomes optional. This is where the two philosophies divided. Patton read the same maps Montgomery read. He looked at the same Rhine, the same eastern bank, the same German defenses. He reached completely different conclusions, not because he was smarter and not because Montgomery was wrong, but because he was looking for something different. Montgomery was looking for the place where overwhelming force could be applied most effectively. Patton was looking for the place where force did not need to be overwhelming because nobody was there. He found it at Oppenheim. His engineers and staff had been evaluating the Rhine's western bank for weeks with criteria that were almost the opposite of conventional assault planning. They were not looking for the established crossing points, the historical fords, the places with road connections and flat approaches that made military sense. The places that made military sense were exactly where the German planners were looking. They wanted somewhere that did not make sense on paper. Somewhere that appeared on the German priority list the way a footnote appears on a document. Oppenheim sat 12 miles south of Mainz on the western bank. The eastern bank here was low and relatively flat, good for getting troops ashore and moving them quickly inland. The current at this stretch was manageable. The Rhine here ran no more than 1,000 feet wide, and the German garrison assigned to this sector was, as Patton's intelligence confirmed, not a fighting force in any meaningful operational sense. The 5th Infantry Division was assigned the crossing. They called themselves the Red Diamond Division. They had earned that name across more than 20 river crossings in France and Germany, veterans who understood the specific terror and the specific discipline that assault river crossings require. When Major General S. Leroy Irwin received the order from General Manton Eddy of the 12th Corps, an order that carried Patton's unmistakable fingerprints, he had a reaction that was entirely reasonable. He said a well-planned, properly ordered crossing was not possible in the time available. Then he said he could get some troops across. That was enough. What made Patton's plan possible was preparation that had been happening in plain sight for weeks without anyone recognizing what they were looking at. Pontoon sections and bridging equipment had been distributed among ordinary supply convoys, covered in tarpaulins and mixed in with ammunition crates and ration boxes and motor pool spare parts. An engineer's eye might have looked twice. A German reconnaissance pilot flying overhead saw nothing but the same gray streams of logistics trucks that rolled east every day behind every army in this war. The components were staged near the river. They were simply invisible because they were hidden inside the ordinary. The Allied deception machinery had also been working. American radio traffic deliberately mimicked the signatures of a northern buildup. Every fragment of intelligence reaching Berlin confirmed what Berlin already believed: the next great Allied effort would come at Wesel, at Cologne, perhaps at Düsseldorf. Not here. Not among the vineyards and wine towns of the central Rhine. Not at a crossing point that barely appeared on the priority defense lists. The trap was set by making the truth look like the exception. Around March 19th, 4 days before Montgomery's scheduled crossing, General Omar Bradley called Patton. Bradley was a farmer's son from Missouri with a mild face and soft-spoken manner that concealed a fierce competitive streak and a deep investment in American military prestige within the coalition. He was Patton's direct superior, the commander of the 12th Army Group, and he was, by his own account in his post-war memoir, not neutral about what was about to happen. He told Patton to take the Rhine on the run. The exact words of that conversation have been debated by historians ever since, because the precise boundaries of what was authorized and what was assumed and what was simply understood without being spoken turn out to matter enormously. Bradley's own memoir confirms that he encouraged Patton to cross before Montgomery. The official United States Army history confirms that Bradley told Patton to take the Rhine on the run. What remains genuinely murky is the extent to which Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe, was formally aware of what was being planned in the days leading up to the crossing. The official record says Eisenhower was surprised. Bradley's memoir suggests something more complicated, and Patton's diary, which is the document that should resolve this question definitively, is conspicuously blank for the days immediately preceding the operation. This is not a minor detail. Patton kept his diary with the discipline of a man who understood that history was watching and wanted to ensure it watched accurately. His entries were detailed, opinionated, and consistent. The man wrote everything down. Everything except the days when a crossing of the Rhine was being planned without formal authorization from Supreme Headquarters. Those pages are empty. There is a language that senior commanders in coalition warfare sometimes speak that is never written down and never needs to be. It is the language of strategic deniability, of knowing something without officially knowing it, of giving an order that is not technically an order, but that everyone in the room understands completely. When powerful men with competing interests need something to happen without anyone being able to say they made it happen, the paperwork develops gaps, the diary goes blank. The phone calls are not logged. Whether Eisenhower formally knew what Patton was planning in the 48 hours before the crossing is a question that the historical record answers with silence, which is itself a kind of answer. The circumstantial evidence, the warm letter Eisenhower wrote to Patton on March the 23rd, the absence of any reprimand. The speed with which Schaeff absorbed the news points toward a more complicated picture than simple surprise. Senior commanders in coalition warfare sometimes choose not to formally know things that give them useful deniability, but nobody said so in writing, which is precisely the point. By the afternoon of March 22nd, the machinery that had been assembling in silence for weeks began its final movement. Pontoon sections were uncovered. Assault boats were lifted from their hiding places in supply convoys and carried by hand, not driven, carried by hand across muddy fields in the fading light. The men of the 5th Infantry Division's 11th Infantry Regiment received their final briefings in whispers, orders passed lip to ear, down lines that stretched back through dark orchards and closed farm roads. No fires, no talking above a murmur. No smoking. The boats would be carried to the riverbank and lowered into the water by hand. The crossing would begin at 10 o'clock. Major General Irwin had his orders. General Eddy had given them. Patton stood behind those orders with the full weight of a man who had been waiting for this river his entire career and had absolutely no intention of waiting one more night. The Volkssturm on the far bank did not know any of this. The elderly men assigned to hold Hitler's sacred river were huddled around whatever warmth they could find on a cold March night, waiting for a war they knew was lost to either find them or end. They had no artillery to speak of. They had no means of calling for rapid reinforcement. They had bolt-action rifles and the myth of the Rhine behind them, and they were about to discover that myths are not bulletproof. At 10 o'clock, the order went down the line. It was passed man to man, in a whisper that traveled through the dark like wind through grass. The boats went into the water. The Rhine took the bows, tugged, and the boats swung with the current as the men compensated. The paddles went in quietly. The dark western bank began to recede. The dark eastern bank began to resolve out of the night ahead. 300 miles to the north, Bernard Montgomery was running through the final details of the largest single military operation since the beaches of Normandy. 1 million men ready to move, 4,000 guns ready to fire. the whole machinery of overwhelming force coiled in waiting for a single command. Here at Oppenheim, 12 men in an assault boat were paddling across the Rhine in silence. And nobody in the Reich had the faintest idea it was happening. Caesar crossed this river to prove that Rome could reach beyond the edge of the known world. Napoleon crossed it in his time. Now, in the last dark hours before the last spring of the war, George Patton was crossing it in a way that neither of them had managed. Not with engineering spectacle or imperial declaration, not with the thunder of preparation, with silence, with audacity disguised as ordinary supply trucks, with the understanding that the most powerful thing a general can do is not to attack where the enemy is strong. It is to disappear into the one place they forgot to watch. The boats were halfway across the Rhine now, and the war was about to change in a place that barely appeared on anyone's map. The first boat touched the eastern bank of the Rhine at approximately 10:30 on the night of March the 22nd, 1945. There was no explosion of gunfire. No flares lighting up the sky, no machine guns opening from fortified positions on the high ground above the water. The men in the lead elements of the 11th Infantry Regiment stepped out of their assault boats into shallow water and onto German soil and found almost nothing waiting for them. What they found instead was a fire. 7 old men sitting around it. This was the defense of Hitler's sacred river at Oppenheim. 7 members of the Volkssturm, the militia of last resort that the Reich had been assembling since the desperate autumn of 1944. When the reality of what was coming from both east and west had finally penetrated the layers of official optimism in Berlin. These men were not soldiers in any meaningful operational sense. They were factory workers, tradesmen, farmers who had already survived one war and been given bolt-action rifles and the honor of defending the river that every German child had been taught to regard as the boundary between civilization and everything beyond it. They had no artillery. They had no radio capable of reaching anyone who could send help quickly. They had their rifles and their fire and the cold March night, and now they had Americans standing in front of them in the dark. The 11th Infantry Regiment moved through them and kept moving. It is worth pausing here to understand what this moment meant not strategically but humanly. The men of the 5th Infantry Division had crossed rivers before. They had crossed the Moselle and the Saar, and those crossings had cost them. They knew what a defended river crossing felt like. They knew the specific weight of getting into a small boat and pushing off into a current while your entire body is waiting for the sound that tells you someone on the far bank has seen you. They had carried that knowledge across France and into Germany, and it lived in them the way combat experience always lives, not as memory exactly, but as a physical understanding of what the world is capable of doing to a man in an open boat on dark water. Tonight was different, and the difference was so profound that some of them did not entirely trust it. The silence had a quality that combat veterans recognized as dangerous. Not the silence of safety, but the silence of the unknown. Every crossing they had made before had resolved itself quickly into chaos or into the specific organized violence of a defended position. This crossing refused to resolve. It just stayed quiet while the boats made trip after trip across the Rhine, bringing more men to the eastern bank, and the quiet held. By midnight, the first 2 companies were across and moving inland to establish a perimeter. By 1 in the morning, the battalion was across. By 2 o'clock in the morning of March 23rd, the entire 11th Infantry Regiment had crossed the Rhine. They were on German soil east of the river, dug in and listening for the counterattack that did not come, and behind them, the boats were already making the return trip to bring the 10th Infantry Regiment across. 6 battalions of American soldiers would stand on the eastern bank of Hitler's sacred river before the sun rose. Total casualties for the assault crossing: 34 dead and wounded. For 6 battalions crossing a major defended river at night, that number borders on the miraculous. General Bradley would write in his memoir that the figure was extraordinarily light. Light does not begin to cover it. Military historians who study river crossing operations understand that the losses at Oppenheim exist in a category that requires explanation, and the explanation is not simply good luck. It is the combination of meticulous concealment, precise timing, intelligent target selection, and the specific genius of choosing to attack at the exact point where the enemy had decided attack was impossible. Patton had not found a gap in the German defenses. He had found the place where the Germans had decided no gap was necessary. But the infantry across the river was only the beginning of what needed to happen before morning. Boots on the eastern bank were not enough to change the course of the war. What was needed was a bridge. Not a bridge in the abstract sense of the word, but a specific load-bearing tank-capable bridge across a moving river in darkness with enemy forces in the surrounding area, built fast enough to be functional before German aircraft could find it in daylight. This was the assignment given to the 249th Engineer Combat Battalion, part of the 1135th Engineer Combat Group under the 12th Corps. The men of the 249th had not been resting while the infantry crossed. They had been staging their equipment on the western bank, organizing the pontoon sections and the bridging components that had been hidden in supply convoys for weeks, preparing for the moment when the order came to begin work. The assault crossing was the opening act. The bridge was the thing that would make the crossing matter. The order to begin came before 2 in the morning. Robert Chalateau was one of those men. He was not a general. He was not an officer whose name would appear in the official histories alongside the names of the commanders who shaped the strategic picture of the European campaign. He was a young American soldier with a job to do in the dark beside a river in Germany, and the job was to build something that military engineers would later describe as extraordinary under the conditions in which it was built. Chalateau would survive the war. He would come home. He would live long enough to attend a ceremony at Nierstein in 2017 at roughly the age of the men who had been warming themselves by that fire on the eastern bank. And he would stand at the exact spot where his battalion had put the first pontoon section into the Rhine 7 decades earlier. He would describe that night to the people gathered at the ceremony with the particular precision of a man who had replayed it many times across many decades and never quite finished processing what it had required of him. He said it was a race against 2 things happening at the same time. The first was dawn. The second was discovery. He said they were equal dangers. The technical requirements of what the 249th was attempting were formidable under any conditions. A tactical pontoon bridge 366 meters long is not a simple structure. It requires precise coordination between teams working simultaneously at multiple points along the crossing, each team dependent on the others maintaining their pace, each section of the bridge useless until it connects to the sections on either side of it. The Rhine at this point was running at a current sufficient to exert constant lateral pressure on the pontoons, which meant that every section had to be anchored against the river's pull while the next section was being positioned. They were doing all of this in darkness. They were doing it in silence, or as close to silence as the work allowed, because noise carried across water at night with an efficiency that every soldier who had ever been on a river at night understood in his bones. And they were doing it with German forces approximately 400 meters away. That is not a comfortable distance in darkness when you are engaged in work that requires movement and the unavoidable sounds of metal on metal and men coordinating complex physical tasks. 400 meters is close enough that a soldier on the far side who is paying attention might hear something that did not belong to the natural sounds of the river. The 249th worked with the specific concentrated discipline of men who understood exactly how little margin they had. The German response began before the bridge was finished. It did not begin at the bridge. German artillery on the eastern bank and in the hills above the river began ranging on the western bank and the approaches to the river, firing into the vineyard country and the fields that surrounded Oppenheim and Nierstein in a pattern that suggested awareness of activity in the area without yet having precise coordinates for the activity itself. Shells fell among the bare vines and into the muddy fields. They fell in the orchards and along the farm roads that led down to the river. They did not hit the bridge. German aircraft appeared above the river. Luftwaffe pilots who had once commanded European skies with near impunity were flying by March of 1945, obsolete aircraft on minimal fuel in an air environment that the Allies had controlled almost completely for months. They came in low over the Rhine and found American anti-aircraft batteries waiting on both banks' batteries that had been positioned in advance for exactly this moment and they were driven back without scoring hits on the bridge or on the men building it. The bridge survived. Section by section, pontoon by pontoon, the 249th pushed their structure across the Rhine. The work crews moved with an economy of motion that had been developed through training and refined through the specific education of doing difficult things under terrible conditions. Each man knew his job. Each team knew its position in the sequence. The river pushed against the pontoons and the men pushed back, and the bridge grew. There is a particular quality to extreme physical effort, conducted under the threat of violent death, that cannot be fully communicated in historical accounts. The men of the 249th that night were not thinking about history. They were thinking about the next section of pontoon and the cables that had to be secured before the current moved it out of position, and the sounds coming from the darkness around them that they were trying not to hear too clearly. They were thinking about whether the man working beside them had a solid grip on his end of the load, and whether the connection they had just made was true, and whether the sound they had just heard was artillery finding its range, or simply the river doing what rivers do in the dark. Shalato said in 2017 that you did not think about what it meant. You thought about what you had to do next. This is how most of history actually gets made. Not by men thinking about history, but by men thinking about the next section of pontoon that needs to go into the water before the light changes. 50 miles away in his command post, George Patton was not sleeping. Patton did not sleep well under any conditions, and he did not sleep at all on nights when something he had set in motion was playing out beyond his direct control. He was a man constitutionally unsuited to waiting. The aggression that made him effective in the field became a liability in the hours when there was nothing to do but sit with a telephone and the knowledge that men were crossing a river in darkness, while he remained on the western bank reading reports and willing the news to be good. He had staked considerable things on this night. Not just the military objective, which was clear and achievable, and which his intelligence suggested was well within reach. He had staked something larger. He had staked the argument he had been making his entire career about the relationship between speed and force, about the premium that military doctrine placed on preparation at the expense of opportunity, about what an army could accomplish if its commander was willing to accept risk in exchange for surprise. He had also staked something personal. The rivalry with Montgomery was not simply professional. It was philosophical, and it was visceral, and it had been building for 2 years across North Africa and Sicily and Normandy and the Low Countries, and now it had arrived at the Rhine, which happened to be one of the most symbolically significant rivers in the history of Western warfare, and Patton understood that perfectly. He was 60 years old. The war was almost certainly going to end in 1945, regardless of what happened at Oppenheim. The question of how it ended and who could claim what in the final accounting was something that occupied his thinking in ways that his public swagger was designed to obscure but never quite succeeded. He waited. The reports came in through the night. The 11th Infantry across, the 10th Infantry following, the perimeter holding. The German response scattered and ineffective, the bridge progressing, and then in the hours before dawn the intelligence that the German armor was moving. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring had received the reports about Oppenheim in the early hours of March 23rd. Kesselring was one of the most capable defensive commanders Germany produced in the entire war. He had held Italy against Allied invasion for 18 months in a defensive campaign that military historians still study as a masterpiece of economy and improvisation. He was methodical, unsentimental about resources, and clear-eyed about what was possible and what was not. He had been appointed Commander-in-Chief West only 11 days before the night of March 22nd, which meant he had inherited a situation that had been deteriorating for months and was now deteriorating in a new and urgent way. He asked his staff the obvious question. What can we get to Oppenheim? The answer came back with the specific flatness of a report that contains no good news. Approximately 60 tanks from the remnants of the 11th Panzer Division located roughly 30 miles from the bridgehead. Limited fuel, ammunition sufficient for perhaps 1 or 2 engagements, no meaningful air support. Luftwaffe assets in the area were scattered remnants flying aircraft that were obsolete against American air power, with pilots on fuel rations that made sustained operations impossible. 18 artillery pieces of mixed calibers with no unified fire control. Kesselring was a man who understood mathematics. To destroy a defended bridgehead, military doctrine required roughly 3-to-1 superiority in the attacking force. The Americans had 6 battalions across the river and were reinforcing by the hour across a bridge that was approaching completion. 60 tanks with limited fuel and ammunition against six battalions of American infantry with more armor and artillery arriving was not a military calculation. It was an epitaph. He reported to Hitler and recommended withdrawal to prepare defensive positions east of the bridgehead. Hitler's response was 4 words: hold at all costs. There was nothing left to hold with. But soldiers follow orders, and Kesselring sent what he had toward Oppenheim, because that is what soldiers do when there is nothing left to do but attack. The 60 tanks from the 11th Panzer Division moved through the dark German countryside toward a river crossing that American engineers were still building. German artillery increased its fire. German aircraft made additional attempts on the bridge and were turned back again by anti-aircraft batteries that had been positioned specifically to prevent exactly that outcome. The German armor came within range of the American artillery on both banks of the Rhine. What followed was not a battle in any balanced sense of the word. American Corps. Division artillery, more than 100 guns with full aerial observation, opened fire on the approaching panzers. P-47. Thunderbolts arrived at first light and dove on the scattered German armor in the fields and roads east of the bridgehead. The 11th Panzer Division, which had once been a force capable of changing the shape of battles across the Eastern Front, arrived at Oppenheim as a collection of tired machines with tired men and not enough fuel to maneuver effectively, and found the full weight of American fire support waiting for them. None of the German tanks reached the bridge. The bridge was still standing when the sun came up on March 23, 1945. 18 hours after the first pontoon section had entered the Rhine, the 249th Engineer Combat Battalion completed their crossing. 366 meters of floating bridge stretched from the western bank to the eastern bank of the river at Nierstein, adjacent to Oppenheim, load-bearing and functional and intact. The Stars and Stripes would later report that the engineers had done it with the enemy only 400 meters away. The memorial plaque erected at the site in 2017 would record that the bridge was completed in 18 hours. The first American tanks began rolling across it before the morning was fully established. There are moments in military history that are recognized immediately as decisive, and moments that only reveal their full significance over time as the consequences ripple outward and the counterfactual becomes clear. The completion of the bridge at Nierstein belongs to the second category. It did not look like the hinge of the European war. It looked like an engineering accomplishment, impressive by any measure, but not obviously the thing that was going to determine how the next 6 weeks unfolded. But the math was already working. 6 battalions of American infantry were on the eastern bank of the Rhine with armor support and a bridge that was fully operational. German forces in the central sector had committed their available reserves in a counterattack that had failed completely. There was nothing behind those reserves. The German defensive depth on the central Rhine, which had been thin to begin with, because Berlin had concentrated its attention on the expected northern crossing at Wesel, was now non-existent. The door was open. 300 miles to the north, Bernard Montgomery did not yet know any of this. He was in the early hours of March 23rd completing the final preparations for Operation Plunder, the largest military undertaking since the beaches of Normandy. 1 million men, 4,000 guns, the full apparatus of overwhelming Allied force aimed at a single point on the Rhine and scheduled to fire in less than 24 hours. Montgomery had been preparing this moment for 6 weeks. He had done it correctly by every measure that military doctrine provided. He had the air superiority. He had the artillery dominance. He had the rehearsed troops and the secure supply lines and the numerical advantage and the naval craft and the smokescreen that had been running for a week. He had done everything right. He did not know that everything right was already 36 hours behind everything audacious. Patton called Bradley from his command post in the early morning hours of March 23rd. The connection on the secure line had the characteristic quality of wartime communications, functional but not comfortable, the voices slightly compressed by the technology. He kept his own voice deliberately low. "Brad," he said, "don't tell anyone, but I'm across." Bradley's response, which he recorded in his memoir with a specificity that suggests he had played the conversation back many times in the years that followed, was immediate. "Well, I'll be damned." "You mean across the Rhine?" "Sure I am," Patton said. "I sneaked a division over last night, but there are so few Germans around there they don't know it yet. So don't make any announcement. We'll see how it goes." There was a particular pleasure in that last sentence that anyone who understood Patton would have recognized immediately. The modesty was theatrical. The instruction not to make an announcement was a man savoring the moment before he chose to share it. He was not being cautious. He was being theatrical in the specific way that men are theatrical when they have done something they have been imagining for a very long time and want to hold the sensation for a moment before it becomes news. He knew how it was going to go. He had known since the first reports came back from the Eastern Bank that it was going to go exactly as he had planned, because the intelligence about what was waiting on the far bank had been correct. And the execution had been as clean as river crossings got, and the bridge was finished and the armor was rolling. He just wanted to keep it quiet for a few more hours. There was one more thing happening that morning that Patton did not know about yet, and when he learned of it, the satisfaction it gave him would become part of the story that his staff retold for years. In London, the BBC was on the air. Winston Churchill had prepared remarks in advance for the Rhine crossing, as was appropriate for an event of this magnitude. The remarks acknowledged the achievement, praised the forces involved, and positioned the crossing of the Rhine as a decisive moment in the Allied campaign to end the war in Europe. The speech was prepared, recorded, and queued for broadcast. It was broadcast on the morning of March the 23rd. It described Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery as the commander of the forces that had achieved the first successful opposed assault crossing of the Rhine in the modern era. Churchill had not been updated. Nobody had checked. Patton had been on the eastern bank of the Rhine for 36 hours when the BBC told the world that Montgomery was about to be the first to cross it. The speech went out over the airwaves to an audience that included American soldiers on the eastern bank of the Rhine who had crossed it the night before last, who had buried their dead in German soil and dug their fighting positions and watched the armor come across the bridge that the 249th had built in 18 hours, and who were now listening to a radio tell them that the crossing of the Rhine was an achievement that belonged to someone else. Patton heard about it later that day. His response, according to the men who were with him, was not anger in the conventional sense. It was something closer to the specific satisfaction of a man who has been proven right about something he has been arguing for a long time and who finds in the absurdity of the moment precisely the confirmation he needed. He had crossed the Rhine in silence. He had crossed it with 34 casualties. He had crossed it while the world was watching somewhere else. And now, the BBC was broadcasting a speech about a crossing that had not happened yet, praising a man who had not yet given the order to move, and somewhere in that particular comedy of errors was the cleanest possible summary of everything Patton believed about the difference between overwhelming preparation and pure audacity. The bridge at Nierstein was open. The armor was rolling east. The door that the German High Command had decided did not exist had been walked through in the dark, and the consequences were already unfolding in the silence of the German countryside beyond the eastern bank, where a defensive line that had existed on maps and in planning documents and in the calculations of Berlin's most experienced strategists was discovering what it meant to have a hole in it that nobody had planned for. The hole was 36 hours old. It was getting wider by the hour. The news reached Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in fragments. That is how significant intelligence always arrives. Not as a clean announcement with a clear timestamp and a complete picture attached. It arrives as pieces, partial reports from different sources that do not yet agree with each other, signals traffic that suggests something without confirming it, telephone calls between staff officers who are themselves working from incomplete information. The picture assembles slowly, and by the time it is complete, the man at the center of it has usually already made several decisions based on the incomplete version. Dwight Eisenhower received the confirmation through Omar Bradley. The people who were present in the room when it arrived described what followed with the kind of precision that witnesses apply to moments they understand immediately as historical. Eisenhower was on the surface calm. He was almost always calm on the surface. It was one of the qualities that had made him the right man for a job that required managing an alliance of enormous egos under conditions of extreme pressure for 3 consecutive years. The surface was controlled, but he put his cigarette down. Then he picked it up again. Then he looked around the room at the people in it, and something passed across his face that the men who worked for him recognized as the expression he wore when he was rapidly recalculating a situation that had just changed in a way he had not fully anticipated. Then he said something that the historical record preserves in various forms across multiple memoirs, all of which agree on the emotional content, if not the precise vocabulary. The word he used was not suitable for the official record. He understood immediately what had happened and what it meant on every level simultaneously. The military level, which was straightforward, Patton had 6 battalions across the Rhine with armor support and a functioning bridge, and the German forces in the central sector had already committed and failed their available counterattack reserve, which meant the door east of Oppenheim was open in a way that German logistics could not close quickly enough to matter. The political level, which was considerably more complicated. Montgomery was British. Britain was an ally whose investment in this war was measured not only in soldiers and equipment, but in national prestige in the story that the British people were telling themselves about their role in the defeat of Nazi Germany. Churchill was personally invested in the narrative of British military achievement. The alliance that Eisenhower had spent 3 years holding together through disputes over strategy and resources and credit and command authority was a living thing that required constant maintenance, and it was about to receive news that one American general had crossed the Rhine 36 hours ahead of the British field marshal, whose crossing was supposed to be the definitive moment of the campaign. If Eisenhower stood up in public and said what he believed privately, which was that Patton's improvised night crossing had achieved in silence, and with 34 casualties, what Montgomery's million-man operation was about to attempt with the full weight of Allied industrial power. The diplomatic consequences within the alliance would be serious in ways that extended beyond the remaining weeks of the war. He could not say it publicly. He wrote Patton a letter on March 23rd. The letter was warm. It acknowledged the achievement in terms that left no ambiguity about Eisenhower's genuine admiration for what the Third Army had accomplished. In private, according to the consistent testimony of aides whose accounts appear in memoirs written across different decades from different vantage points, he called it one of the most brilliant tactical maneuvers of the European campaign. He never made that sentiment public. He managed the news with the same exhausted diplomatic skill he had brought to every major dispute within the alliance since the landings in North Africa. He acknowledged both crossings. He credited both operations. He distributed the available praise with the precision of a man who had learned that coalition warfare was as much about managing relationships as managing armies. He smoked 4 packs of Camels a day. The Rhine crossing probably accounted for several of them. The night of March 23rd brought Operation Plunder. Montgomery gave the order, and the full machinery of 6 weeks of preparation engaged simultaneously. What followed was one of the most spectacular displays of coordinated military force in the history of warfare, and it is important to say that clearly because the comparison with Oppenheim can obscure how genuinely impressive Plunder was on its own terms. Roughly 4,000 Allied artillery pieces opened fire along the northern Rhine at the designated hour. The bombardment lasted 4 hours. The ground shook for miles in every direction. The sky above the river was lit in a continuous flickering that men who witnessed it described in terms that reached for analogy and fell short because there was no adequate analogy. It was simply its own category of experience, the sound and light of industrial-scale violence applied to a specific geography with the intention of making human resistance on the far bank impossible before the first boat touched the water. The crossings at Rhine, at Wesel, south of the Lippe River, went largely according to the plan that Montgomery's staff had been refining for 6 weeks. German resistance, while stiffer than anything that had waited at Oppenheim, was ultimately overwhelmed by the sheer weight of what came across the river. The defending forces on the northern Rhine were real soldiers, organized and armed, and fighting with the specific determination of men who understood that the river behind them was the last natural barrier between the Allied armies and the German heartland. On March 24th, Operation Varsity executed. 14,000 paratroopers descended east of the Rhine in a single morning. It remains the largest single-day airborne operation in the history of warfare. The sky above the eastern bank filled with aircraft, and then with parachutes and the German forces below, found themselves simultaneously engaged from the river crossings in front and from the air above and behind. The operation was a tactical success by any honest measure. The cost was 6,781 Allied casualties across the full operation. On March 24th alone, 1,111 Allied soldiers were killed. It was the worst single day for Allied airborne forces in the entire war. By the time those men went into the ground east of the Rhine, Patton's engineers already had armor rolling across a bridge that had been standing for more than 24 hours. The comparison was not something that anyone in the Allied High Command discussed openly, because discussing it openly would have required acknowledging things that the diplomatic situation made it impossible to acknowledge. But the numbers existed regardless of whether anyone discussed them. 34, 6,781. One river, 1 week, 2 philosophies, 2 outcomes. The full truth is more complicated than those numbers suggest, and it is worth saying so directly because Patton himself characteristically was not interested in the complicated version. Montgomery faced organized resistance on the northern Rhine that bore no resemblance to the depleted garrison at Oppenheim. The German 1st Parachute Army was defending the Wesel sector with real soldiers who had real weapons and real training and real orders to hold. The disparity in casualties was not solely a reflection of the difference in planning philosophy. It was also a reflection of the difference in what was waiting on the far bank. But Patton had found the depleted sector because he had looked for it. That was the point he was making, and the numbers did not diminish it. By the time German forces had confirmed the crossing and secrecy had exhausted its tactical value, Patton had already made the first call to Bradley in the small hours, the quiet one, the conspiratorial one, the one where he told his commander not to tell anyone and then waited to see how it went. Now he made the second call, and the voice was entirely different. "Brad," he said, "for God's sake, tell the world we're across. I want the world to know that 3rd Army made it before Monty starts across." Bradley obliged. The press release went out. American newspapers that were already going to press with Montgomery's artillery preparation as their lead story found themselves holding a different story. One dated the previous evening describing a crossing of the Rhine by American forces of the 3rd Army that had been accomplished in silence and with minimal casualties before the first British gun had fired. The story was accurate. The timing was devastating. By the time Montgomery's massive preparatory bombardment lit up the northern Rhine sky on the night of March the 23rd, American newspapers were already carrying headlines about a crossing that had happened the night before that. The man who had told the world to watch Wesel was watching from behind. 2 days after the crossing on March 24th, 1945, Patton arrived at the pontoon bridge at Oppenheim. His aide, Colonel Charles Codman, was present, and Codman's memoir provides a more detailed account of what followed than Patton's own writing, which in characteristic fashion compressed the moment into something more decorous than what actually occurred. Patton led the small procession across the bridge with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had been thinking about this walk for a long time. He stopped in the middle. He looked down at the surface of the Rhine moving slowly beneath the pontoons, the same river that Caesar had crossed, that Napoleon had crossed, that 2,000 years of European history had used as the boundary between the world men knew and the world they feared. Then he unbuttoned his trousers. He urinated into the Rhine. "I have been looking forward to this," he said. That evening he sent a communiqué to Eisenhower at Supreme Headquarters. The message was brief and entirely in character. "Dear Schaeff," he wrote, "I have just pissed into the Rhine River. For God's sake, send some gasoline." It was pure Patton in the way that only Patton could manage to be purely himself at maximum historical density. He had crossed the river that symbolized the final barrier of Germany. He had done it in a way that would be studied in military academies for generations. He had the photographs, he had the bridge, he had the armor rolling east, and his communication to his supreme commander was a request for fuel and a toilet joke. When he stepped off the bridge onto the eastern bank of the Rhine, he bent down and scooped 2 handfuls of German soil from the ground. Thus, William the Conqueror, he said. He was referring to the Norman king who famously stumbled and fell when landing on the beach in England in 1066, then converted what could have been received as a bad omen into a declaration of possession by holding up the earth he had grabbed to break his fall. Patton had studied that story the way he had studied every story about commanders who understood that the theater of warfare was inseparable from its substance. The gesture was deliberate. The words were chosen. He was making himself part of a list that ran from Caesar to Napoleon to William, and he was doing it on the eastern bank of the Rhine with German soil in both hands. He was not a modest man. He had never pretended to be a modest man. What followed the crossing at Oppenheim was not so much a military campaign as a dissolution. The German Central Front did not break in the way that defensive lines break under sustained pressure, with organized withdrawal and reformed positions and the kind of tactical flexibility that allows a defeated force to remain a coherent fighting entity. It collapsed. The distinction matters. By March 26th, 18,000 American soldiers had crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim and Nierstein. By March 28th, the bridgehead was 30 miles deep. The German reserves that might have contained it had been committed and destroyed in the failed counterattack of March 23rd, and there was nothing behind them. The Luftwaffe that might have interdicted the bridge and slowed the buildup was flying obsolete aircraft on minimal fuel against American air power that had controlled European skies for more than a year. Kesselring understood what was happening and had no tools left to change it. Patton's Third Army took Frankfurt on March 29th. Frankfurt was not a minor objective. It was one of the major cities of central Germany, a transportation hub and industrial center whose fall opened the interior of the country to Allied advance in ways that the German High Command had spent months trying to prevent. It fell in a week after the Rhine crossing. They reached Nuremberg in early April. They were in Bavaria by the middle of April. The drive from the Rhine to the Austrian border across the interior of a country that had held Allied forces at its western boundary for 8 months took fewer than 4 weeks. Consider that timeline against what had preceded it. 8 months from the beaches of Normandy to the Rhine. Through the hedgerows of France and the fortifications of the Siegfried Line and the dense killing ground of the Hürtgen forest and the desperate German offensive in the Ardennes that became the Battle of the Bulge. 8 months of fighting that cost hundreds of thousands of casualties on both sides and consumed material resources on a scale that staggers the imagination even now. Then, 4 weeks from the Rhine to the effective end of organized German resistance in the West. The bridge at Nierstein was the point where those 2 timelines met. Germany surrendered on May 7, 1945. It was 46 days after Patton's soldiers had paddled across the Rhine in the dark. Montgomery's memoirs, published after the war, addressed Oppenheim with the specificity of a man who had made a decision about how much space the subject deserved and adhered to it precisely. He gave it 1 sentence. The crossing at Oppenheim, he wrote, was of minor tactical significance. Military historians have been disagreeing with that sentence ever since it was written. Montgomery carried his assessment to the end of his life. He died in 1976 at the age of 88. Having spent 31 years elaborating and defending his record with the same methodical intensity he had brought to his campaigns. He did not change his mind about Oppenheim. He never needed to in his own accounting. That was perhaps the most Montgomery thing about him. The man who had planned everything had also planned how history would remember him, and he executed that plan with the same thoroughness he brought to everything else regardless of what the historians said. Eisenhower became the 34th President of the United States. He served 2 terms from 1953 to 1961 and managed in public to be as careful about the Rhine crossing as he had been in March of 1945. He never delivered the public verdict that his private words, as recorded by aides and staff across decades of memoirs, suggested he had reached. He understood that some verdicts are more useful unspoken, and he had spent his career developing a sophisticated understanding of which verdicts those were. The disagreement between the two philosophies, between Montgomery's calculated overwhelming force and Patton's calculated audacity, did not resolve at Oppenheim. It continued in military academies and staff colleges and history departments for the rest of the century and beyond. Both men had won. Both men had accomplished their objectives. Both men had contributed to the defeat of Germany. The argument was about something more abstract than outcome, something closer to the question of what military excellence actually looks like when it is operating at its highest level. The lesson of the bridge outlasted the war in ways that were practical rather than philosophical. The techniques developed and refined by the 249th Engineer Combat Battalion at Nierstein. The concurrent work teams, the pre-positioning of bridge components inside ordinary supply convoys, the speed calculations that made 18 hours look like a baseline rather than an exceptional achievement, became standard doctrine. American engineers built bridges faster in subsequent conflicts, partly because the men at Nierstein had demonstrated what was possible when preparation and discipline were applied at the right moment by the right people with the right training. The engineering achievement became the inheritance. Patton himself did not live to see any of that inheritance develop. He had survived everything the war could manufacture. 2 world wars. Sicily, the suspension and the return, the bulge and the pivot at Bastogne that still gets studied in staff colleges. Every river between Normandy and the Rhine. He had been shot and decorated and humiliated and reinstated and celebrated and resented, sometimes in the same week, by the same people. He had made himself into something that the history of this war could not ignore, and he had done it on his own terms, at his own pace, against the advice of people who were usually right about everything except him. What came next, he had not planned for. None of it was supposed to happen on a road outside Mannheim on a December afternoon on the way to shoot pheasant. On December 9th, 1945, 7 months after the German surrender, his 1938 Cadillac staff car was traveling on a road near Mannheim. At a road junction, the car struck a United States Army truck. The collision was not high speed. It was the kind of accident that happens at intersections everywhere, a matter of timing and angles and the ordinary randomness of vehicles moving through space. It broke his neck. He was taken to the United States Army Hospital in Heidelberg. The doctors told him what the injury meant. He would not ride again. He would not walk again. The life he had built around physical dominance and constant motion had ended at a road junction in Germany, not in battle, not crossing a river, not leading anything toward anything. He had survived 2 world wars and Sicily and the Bulge, and every crossing from Normandy to the Rhine, and he was going to die from a truck on a road in peacetime Germany, 7 months after the war that had defined him had ended without him. His response to the prognosis has been recorded in various forms across multiple accounts, but the substance is consistent across all of them. This is a hell of a way to die. He lingered for 12 days. The blood clot formed while he was paralyzed from the neck down, and on December the 21st, 1945. George Smith Patton Jr. died in a hospital in Heidelberg, 60 years old, in the country he had done as much as any single man to defeat. He was buried on Christmas Eve at the Luxembourg American Cemetery among the soldiers of the Third Army who had fallen at the Battle of the Bulge. He had asked to be buried with his men. It was perhaps the most unambiguous thing he ever said about what he actually valued beneath the revolvers and the helmet and the theatrical profanity and the photograph on the bridge at Oppenheim. The men. He wanted to be with the men. Which brings us to the men nobody remembers and why they matter more than the accounting of credit would suggest. George Patton gets the headlines. He always did, and he worked hard to make sure of it. The gleaming helmet and the ivory revolvers were not accidents. The telegram to Eisenhower about urinating into the Rhine was not spontaneous. The handful of German earth and the reference to William the Conqueror were prepared in advance by a man who understood that the theater of warfare was inseparable from its substance, and who had been thinking about how he wanted to stand on the eastern bank of the Rhine since long before there was a war to take him there. He gets the film with George C. Scott. He gets the opening speech in front of the enormous flag. He gets the biographies and the arguments about whether he was a genius or a narcissist, or both simultaneously, which he was. The men who built the bridge get a plaque in Nierstein. The 249th Engineer Combat Battalion. 366 meters of pontoon bridge across the Rhine in 18 hours, with German forces 400 meters away in darkness without making enough noise to give away their position under artillery fire that fell in the vineyards around them and aircraft that came in low and were driven off by batteries positioned specifically to protect what those men were building. Their commanding officer and the specific team leaders who directed the construction are not household names. They do not appear in the popular histories alongside Patton and Bradley and Eisenhower and Montgomery. They appear in the unit records and in the technical assessments and in the after-action reports that engineers write when they want to understand how something was accomplished so it can be accomplished again. And in the memory of Robert Shalato. In the spring of 2017, a ceremony was held at Nierstein at the exact spot where the first boat had touched the eastern bank of the Rhine 72 years earlier. A monument of granite and bronze was dedicated at that location. German and American flags flanked it. The inscription named the 249th Engineer Combat Battalion specifically and described what they had accomplished in language chosen to honor the achievement without glorifying the violence that had made it necessary. Robert Shalato was there. He was the last living veteran of the crossing, the last man still alive who had been on the Rhine that night as a member of the battalion that built the bridge. He stood at the river's edge and looked at the water that he had last worked beside from a boat in the dock in 1945, and he found whatever it is that men find when they return to the places where they were young and afraid and did something that turned out to matter more than they knew at the time. He did not give a speech full of grand claims about history and significance. He talked about what it had actually been like. The cold. The dark. The sound of the river against the pontoons. The knowledge of what was 400 meters away, and what would happen to the bridge and to everyone on it if the Germans found their range before the last section was in place. The discipline of not thinking about any of that, and concentrating on the next cable, the next pontoon, the next connection that had to be made before the current shifted it out of position. He said it was a race against dawn and against discovery in equal measure, and that the men who ran that race deserved to be remembered by name. The plaque says so. Helen Patton stood at that ceremony. Catherine Rommel stood beside her, the granddaughter of the general who had raced across France and wheeled his army at Bastogne and crossed the Rhine in the dark and sent a telegram about it that became part of the legend of the war, and the granddaughter of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, the commander who had faced Patton's forces in North Africa in 1943, who had been implicated in the July 1944 plot against Hitler and given the choice between a public trial and a private death with poison, who had chosen the poison to protect his family from what a public trial would have meant for them. 2 women. 2 families. 2 nations that had spent 6 years directing the full industrial capacity of modern civilization toward destroying each other. Standing together at the place where a boatload of American soldiers had stepped onto a foreign shore in the dark and found a depleted garrison where a formidable defense was supposed to be. The ceremony had a quality that those who attended it described carefully, because the words available for such moments are never quite adequate to the moments themselves. There is a specific emotional register that belongs to occasions when history becomes personal, when the abstraction of dates and troop movements and casualty figures resolves itself into the specific faces of people who carry the weight of what happened in their blood and their names. The granite and the bronze and the flags were the official version of the story. The 2 women standing together were the human version. Both versions were true. Neither was complete without the other. The lesson that Oppenheim teaches is not the lesson that Patton wanted it to teach, or not only that lesson. Patton wanted it to teach that audacity beats preparation, that speed beats caution, that the man willing to move without permission will always arrive before the man waiting for perfect conditions. There is truth in that reading. The numbers support it in ways that are genuinely difficult to argue against. But the deeper lesson is something more precise. The Germans had done everything right. They had planned for every conceivable Allied crossing point along the Rhine. They had fortified the eastern bank where it mattered most. They had blown every bridge that could have been used against them. They had positioned their forces according to the best military thinking available to them, developed over years of warfare on multiple fronts, refined through experience that was as hard as any army in the war had accumulated. They had applied their doctrine with precision and with genuine competence. They lost to a place they had forgotten to watch. Not because their doctrine was wrong. Doctrine is the accumulated wisdom of everything that has worked before, and it is valuable precisely because it represents tested knowledge rather than improvisation. It tells you where danger is most likely to come from. It tells you how to organize your resources against the most probable threats. It is in the hands of competent commanders, an essential tool. But doctrine applied without imagination creates blind spots. It tells you where the danger is likely to come from, and thereby tells a sufficiently intelligent enemy where you are not looking. The man who has read only the doctrine knows what to defend. The man who understands the doctrine knows which defense has a gap in it. Patton understood doctrine as well as anyone in the Allied armies. He had studied it, taught it, applied it across 2 wars in 3 continents. He knew what the rules said about opposed river crossings. He knew the preparation required the artillery, needed the air cover, the logistics, the numerical ratios that made success probable. He knew all of it. He knew it well enough to recognize the one moment when setting it aside was the correct answer. That is the distinction that Oppenheim illustrates, and it is not a distinction that resolves easily into a simple lesson about boldness or caution or the virtue of breaking rules. It is a distinction about depth of understanding. The shortcut is only available to the person who has traveled the long road enough times to know where the shortcut goes. The exception is only recognizable to the person who has internalized the rule well enough to see where it stops applying. Patton had done the long road. He had done it across 2 wars and 30 years of professional study and a career that included spectacular successes and at least one spectacular failure that nearly ended everything. He arrived at Oppenheim not as a man who ignored doctrine, but as a man who understood it at a level that made the exception visible when it presented itself. The exception presented itself as a small wine town with flat banks and a manageable current and a garrison that existed more in the planning documents than on the ground. He took it. The Rhine does not care about any of this. It runs through Oppenheim at 3 knots cold in winter, slow and green in summer, indifferent to the men in the armies and the decisions that have been made on its banks across 2,000 years of history. It ran the same way on the night of March 22nd, 1945, when the boats went in and the paddles went under and the silence held. It runs the same way now. At Nierstein, the monument stands at the exact spot where the first boat landed. The flags move in whatever wind comes off the water. The inscription names the right people. The river keeps moving. Germany surrendered on May 7th, 1945. Patton was buried on Christmas Eve of that same year among the soldiers he had led. The 249th Engineer Combat Battalion was demobilized, and the men went home to lives that had nothing in them that looked like what they had done on the Rhine. Robert Shalato lived long enough to stand at the monument and tell people what it had actually been like, which is the most valuable thing a witness can do, and then he was gone too. What remains is the record and the monument and the river. 34 casualties, 18 hours, 6 battalions on the eastern bank before sunrise. 1 bridge that changed the arithmetic of a war in a single night. And 1 general who had been waiting his whole life for that river, who crossed it in silence, who stood on a bridge above it 2 days later and did something that history books record in carefully chosen language, who sent a telegram to Supreme Headquarters that contained a bathroom joke and a request for fuel, who stepped onto German soil with 2 handfuls of earth and a reference to a Norman king, and who was buried 7 months later among the men he had led because he had asked to be. He was not a simple man. He was not a modest one. But he understood something about the relationship between preparation and opportunity, between doctrine and imagination, between the rule and the moment when the rule is the obstacle that made him, on the night of March the 22nd, 1945, exactly the right man on exactly the right bank of exactly the right river. The boats went in. The paddles went under. The silence held, and the war, quietly and without announcement, began its last movement toward the end.